My name is Matthew Zimmerman. I am a second semester graduate student in convergence journalism at the University of Missouri. I teach a section of J2100, news writing and reporting, which is the final class undergrads need to take before they can enter their sequence in the school. Well, I've only taught 2100 for one semester, but one thing that I felt very strongly about was that if these youngsters are going to learn how to write for newspapers or learn how to report for newspapers or other media, they should be well aware of current events constantly. But also, while reading newspapers, I wanted them to be able to absorb AP style and grammar kind of by osmosis. But also, what I told them to do in class was to examine the stories and figure out how they would have approached them. Because newspapers are freely available here on campus. You put in your card, the thing opens, you get your free newspaper. New York Times, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, The Missourian, USA Today. So I asked them to bring the newspapers to class every Wednesday and Friday for the lab sessions and be ready to discuss how they would have approached a certain story, what they liked about the way the writer approached about a story, what they didn't like about the writer's approach. That way I wanted them to start thinking critically about media. I had a professor about 13 years ago, shows how old I am, in junior college, my first journalism professor, who said that in journalism courses, first and foremost, you need to become a better consumer of the media. Because once you start thinking of media critically, then you'll be able to become a better journalist yourself. You need to be the type of person who watches KOMU and says, or not KOMU, but TV news, and says, well, wait a minute, why'd they do that story that way? Or who reads a newspaper and almost wants to pull out a red pen to correct all the things you see. Well, I have my students do a monthly memo where they discuss what they've learned, what they expect to learn next, and how they feel the class is going for them as an individual. Not so much to talk about their grades, which I found that undergrads here are very, very worried about constantly, but to talk about their goals. And if they feel that this particular journalism class is following its goal of getting them ready for their sequence, because it's the final class before their sequence. I had some kids who, in the first month, they wrote about how they were nervous, because I had them turn in the first memo after the first week. They wrote about how they were nervous, how they didn't feel very good about, writing and their abilities and things like that. And a month later, the second memos, of 17 kids in the class, I think 10 of them wrote how much they appreciated having to read the newspaper, because they know that for a journalist, knowing what's going on is critical. And there were a few of those who said that reading the newspapers every day and watching TV news with a more critical eye meant that they knew how to approach their stories better. They knew how to do a story better, how to think, well, wait a minute, why didn't they do that? And then take that over to their own work. We talk about these different things about different ways to approach stories, and I open it up for a lot of discussion. It's an hour, 15-minute lab, 2 days a week, and probably the first half hour is usually spent discussing newspaper stories. And there's sometimes when people raise their hands and just say, I read this story in this New York Times and it was really good and I just wanted to share it with everybody, which is fine, because I think it's good that if we encourage today's undergrads to enjoy reading a newspaper, because, again, newspapers are, more and more people are reading them online. And, I definitely encourage them to do it, because what I'll do is I'll bring in a story. There was a story a few months ago in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about the husband picked up the 4-year-old child and then went to run his errands. He wasn't supposed to pick up their child usually, but this particular day he had the kid. He goes to run errands, forgets the kids in the car, comes back out, kid has died of heat stroke. And what I said to the class was, how would you approach this story? How do you approach this family? What do you say to them? Do you have a plan for approaching them? Do you make sure that they know that you respect what they're going through? Do you start banging on doors around the neighborhood? What do you do? How do you approach this? How do you treat this story? How do you go about being a reporter on a story of this nature?